Thank you so much for having me, Vahid. And before I begin, I want to acknowledge that I'm on the unceded ancestral land of the Lenape people here in New York City. And look, I only have 15 minutes, and there are so many different surveillance topics I could discuss with you here today that we could go on for hours. But I want to make sure that we keep this as interactive as possible. So for those of you who are on YouTube, please feel free to submit questions there. I'll be monitoring that as well as through the Zoom platform as well. But when we're looking at the big tech relationship with surveillance, I wanted to talk about a company that told us that, well, they thought a little bit differently about privacy, and that of course is Apple, the company that tried to hold itself out as being discrete from the surveillance capitalist landscape where our data was constantly just sold to the highest bidder for ads. And what we've seen in recent weeks is just a series of self-inflicted injuries for that company's reputation, a betrayal of the promise it makes to millions of consumers, and an attack on the privacy that was promised for our cell phones. So, if you go down the highway in Silicon Valley, you will see massive billboards that just say privacy as in giant letters that are spelled out, telling you that you should think of these iPhones as being private. But the problem is that the privacy they promised isn't really manifesting in reality. What we saw, earlier this year was an announcement that really shook the confidence a lot of us had in Apple to the core. The idea that they would start introducing spyware onto our own devices, that they would bake it into the operating system, making it an inescapable part of using the phones. And of course, when you see surveillance rolled out, it's always rolled out in the name of combating something horrific. 20 years after 9/11, we know all too well that the surveillance tools that were sold to the public as a way of combating terrorism are now routinely used to target shoplifters, to target people accused of misdemeanors, to target unhoused people simply because of their lack of stable housing. And that is not an exaggeration. Here in New York, the HomeStat program is a homelessness intelligence nerve center using those same post 9/11 surveillance technologies to track unhoused New Yorkers. And so when you hear that a new surveillance tool is being introduced, you can't just look at the thing that the company is saying it will be targeted at. You have to think of all the other things it will be targeted at down the road. And so you have to ask yourself this very basic question: how else can this tool be used? With Apple, they rolled out their technology, targeting child sexual abuse material, one of the most horrific crimes you could imagine. But they said that the tracking would stop there, that it wouldn't go any further, that it would just be used for this one purpose. And so we asked that one question. A lot of activists who pushed back, led by the amazing people at Electronic Frontier Foundation and also Fight for the Future, which had done the bulk of the national organizing on it. They asked this question: well, how else can this same technology be used? Is there something here that inherently limits it to being used to target this horrific crime? Or could it be expanded? And what we saw was a surveillance system that would be baked into our own phones that could be used to search for anything, that could be targeted by authoritarian governments to look for political messages, religious messages, that could be used by our own government here in the United States to target anything they thought of as being a particular threat. Now, once you opened up that Pandora's box of creating the infrastructure for tracking within the end user devices, you were irrevocably destroying the level of protection we once had for the information that are stored on our phones. And so, there was a nationwide pushback. There was tens of thousands of people who signed petitions. There was vocal denunciation in the media. There were protests like just outside Apple stores here in New York and Boston, all around the country. And Apple paused. They said that they will not move forward with this proposal for now. But that's a far cry from giving up on it completely. And what we see in that sort of halfway response to all of the public denunciation is this, really alarming realization that for all of these years that Apple has been convincing us that they would be better at standing up to government abuse, that they would be more trustworthy when it came to our data, that really you can never fully put your trust in these tech companies to do the right thing over the long term. And with Apple, when you look beyond the fine print, it starts to get deeply concerning, not just about what they propose, but the situation today. So one thing I wanted to highlight is, I've done a bit of work with Evan Selinger, an amazing researcher at RIT, and we had looked at, well, what is Apple doing today to protect our privacy? They talk a lot about standing up to the FBI, the Department of Justice, when the federal government said, you need to break into your own iPhones, and they refuse. This is an incredibly high-profile debate back in 2014. This is something that garnered them national support and a few people who decried the opposition. But on the whole, it cemented Apple's perception as a company that would go farther to protect our data. But what few people realized at the time is that Apple built in a backdoor. That for years, they have said that we won't go and build a cryptographic backdoor to your own phone. We won't let the government in when they seize that hardware. But they build a massive loophole in the form of iCloud. Now, for those of you who use iOS devices, who use Apple products, you constantly get encouraged to move your data to the cloud, to use iCloud, to have that be the place where your data lives. But when your data is stored there, it's stored at your own peril. Because as Apple's own documentation makes clear, all it takes is one court order, one subpoena, one warrant, and suddenly all of that iCloud data is open for the government to take. That suddenly all of the data from these highly secure devices that are touted in those massive billboards on the side of the road, well, those will suddenly be up for any government agency that can take it. And it gets worse, because at the same time that Apple is building the legal compliance infrastructure to hand this data over to the government, tens of thousands of times a year, they're also, we also see our own government building up the adversarial infrastructure to break in on those occasions when Apple won't comply. This week, like a lot of people, I got the hurried emails to install the latest iOS emergency update and deal with this massive exploit that had been discovered by security researchers. If any of you are watching this on an iPhone, an iPad, a Mac laptop, and you haven't installed the latest operating system, please do it. Please do it immediately, because what they found was an exploit that could allow someone to hack into your device by sending you a message, and it would be a message where you wouldn't even have to click on a link. It was something called a zero-click exploit, something where no matter how hard you tried to block it from infecting your machine, you were still vulnerable. And so Apple went and they patched that exploit. But the fact that that vulnerability was there to begin with highlighted this multi-million-dollar industry that is funded in part by the US government, a series of private companies whose entire mission is to break in to our own computers and phones and tablets. In this case, it was the NSO group that was responsible for the software that could hack into our computers. But there are dozens of others that build hardware or software that's designed to break our encryption, to break into our devices. And this, to me, raises just a really fundamental question for our governments at the state, the local, and even the federal level. is this the sort of technology we want to be funding, that we want to be bringing into the world? Because even if for some reason you think that our government can be trusted with the power to break into any device they want, whenever they want, for whatever reason they want, there's a big difference between that and then trusting any government, any private company, which is able to buy this technology to do the same. And we've seen, authoritarian governments around the world. We've seen private companies using these sorts of tools to target journalists, to target activists, to target progressive groups, to target organizers, to use these new technologies to suppress and punish dissent. And so, to me, it is an inherently undemocratic technology to use these sorts of tools to break into people's phones and tablets and computers. And it's something that we should not be funding by having contracts with the people who make it. It would be like us funding people who are developing weapons of mass destruction and selling them to the highest bidder around the world. None of us would feel safer at night thinking that there's an arms dealer funded by our own government selling dangerous weapons to the highest bidder. But that's what we're doing in digital form. That's what we continue to be doing every time the government refuses to allow us to have securely encrypted devices. And it's something that we're unleashing on millions of people around the world. And it's not just the NSO group, it's not just those who break into our devices, it's the entire ecosystem of surveillance, all of the vendors who are, profiting off of government contracts here in the US to then market their tools abroad. Vendors who make drones, who make predictive policing, who make facial recognition software. These chilling new technologies that have the ability to, really extend authoritarian control to levels that previously were unimaginable. This stuff is worse than Orwell's worst nightmares. And yet we're making this available to any government that's willing to pay a price, and increasingly to private citizens as well. And so when we look at the broader impact that Silicon Valley is having, when we're looking at what it means to throw a monkey wrench, we have to deal with those impacts here at home. We have to look at the harms that these systems are enabling here, but we also have to understand the broader global impact that our technologies, that our companies, that our tax-funded surveillance tools are having on people around the world. Luckily, you'll be hearing some amazing activists today who have been taking effort to really put a stop to these sorts of abuses, particularly, grassroots local activists who have tried to and succeeded in blocking these technologies from being used in our, own backyards. And when you see those sorts of successes, I think it really is an amazing blueprint for how these technologies can be banned in the future, how, community by community, city by city, town by town, we can build this nationwide and perhaps even a global solidarity campaign to end the use of these sorts of technologies, to put groups like the NSO group out of business, to make sure that when we see that bulletin board, that billboard on the side of the road that's promising us privacy in massive letters, that it's actually worth the paper it's printed on. Because sitting here today, we see a lot of people selling us on that promise of privacy, but very few that are able to deliver. And until we see sweeping structural changes just across the United States, that entire idea of a technology that we can trust is going to remain an unfulfilled promise. Well, I see my time is up, so I will end it there, but I'm really looking forward to coming back for the panel a little bit later. And thank you again for giving me the chance to join you today.